Hello YouTube. So, I want to further discuss the Western canon when it comes to literature, and in the process I want to discuss and review the Canterbury Leatherbound Classics Collection. It's a collection of books that you may have seen in the background of a few videos. They are right there now. If you look closely, you'll notice a few of them are missing from that list, that pile there. It's because I'm physically holding them. The first one I have here is Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales by the Brothers Grimm. It is a lovingly put together collection, and all of the Canterbury Classics Collection do the same thing, which I really like. They start with a small section with a picture and an introduction about the author themselves. Now in this case, this is a decent introduction to the Brothers Grimm and who they are. It's 11 pages of background on the Brothers Grimm themselves before we get into the storylines. Now, the stories are pretty well represented. There are no illustrations. The only picture that I see in the book is the photograph of the Brothers Grimm at the beginning. But whilst there's no illustrations, the binding itself is particularly nice. The gold leaf on the edge of the pages is very, very well put together. It's well inlaid. It doesn't seem to be rubbing off too easily, which I'm enjoying. The leather-bound card cover, and it is just a thick cardboard bound in leather. So it would put up to some punishment, but not a great deal. I wouldn't want to have anything impact this too hard, and I imagine when the cover is open, that won't withstand much strain. So you'd want to be careful with it still. One nice thing is that it does in fact open flat. As you can see here, you can open it completely flat and read from it on a table. That is lovely, and all of the Canterbury Classics open flat like that. With the possible exception of the Jane Austen collection, which I think is simply too damn big to open flat when you're reading the first few pages. So you might want to give it a bit more leniency there, and on the off chance that you might damage the spine. But the others all open flat fine, even right down to opening at the beginning. The cover will open flat, as you can see there, and it's fine. You can have it open flat. Like those first few pages won't stay down. You'd have to hold them down for like the first maybe 20 pages or so. But once you get to about here, it's lying flat and open quite comfortably. The text is not too far from the middle to waist space, but it's not running into the margins. You can read it comfortably without having to force the pages open in any way. And it lies comfortably flat, even when you're opening only the first few pages. I cannot complain. So that's the Brothers Grimm collection. I also have the Charles Dickens collection here, which is Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, Great Expectations, and A Tale of Two Cities, which are, frankly, pretty much all of my favourites. The gold leafing is, again, really, really well placed. It's really nice, and there is a slight issue where when you get to a book this size, you'll notice the pages start to dip in the middle as gravity pulls the pages down. You can counteract that a little bit by, as daft as it may sound, placing the book upside down for a day or two, and it will slowly slowly pull the pages back into place, or if you get a little bit of folded tissue paper and place it underneath the pages while it's on the shelf, right at the edges there, it will stop the pages from sacking quite so badly. Again, not so important with a book this thick, but with the Jane Austen collection, which is almost twice as thick, like it's beefy. It's like a doorstop. That one, I would say that one probably needs the tissue paper to keep the pages from bowing quite a lot. I really like the silver of this book. It's a very, very pretty book. It feels like a premium product, which is lovely. The binding isn't too bad. It feels strong. It's not a glued binding. It's a proper sewn binding, so it's going to withstand a fair bit of punishment. And again, as with the previous one, we have at the beginning an introduction with Charles Dickens and his life, his achievements here. We've got 13 pages of history about who Charles Dickens was. So you go in knowing about him. You go in understanding him. It's a really, really nice collection. And I think that for a lot of people, Charles Dickens is someone who you'll look on as that person that you heard about in school, and you'll go, oh, not Dickens. No, I don't want to read that crap. But honestly, like, go back and give it a try as an adult, and you will find that a lot of what Charles Dickens wrote was really, really well written and really evocative. Like, A Christmas Carol is a classic, and it's only a short novella. It's not a long book. You can read through that really, really easily. Like, looking at this now, I mean, there's, as far as I'm aware, no illustrations in these books. I am aware that there is a bit of a creaking sound. Which is a little concerning. What that is moisture on the gold leaf causes the gold leaf to stick to itself ever so slightly. So you get this weird cracking sound. But as you can see, it's not happening as much anymore. So it is just where the gold leaf is pulling against itself, where it's acting almost like a vacuum. It's not actually a problem with the binding. That's something that I realised quickly. I'm not sure if you've actually heard that creaking. It's a little concerning when you first hear it, but honestly it's not a problem. But yeah, there are no illustrations in this book. The text is a fair bit smaller, because the book is trying to be maintained at a reasonable size. So the text is variable in size in these books. One thing that I will say is Oliver Twist is 285 pages long, or 284 pages long, sorry. And A Christmas Carol is only 52 pages long. So that gives you an idea of just how big that is. It's only 52 pages out of this entire thing. So Oliver Twist is the first novel in this, and that takes you almost to 300 pages. In fact, A Christmas Carol represents the largest... Oliver Twist represents the largest story in this book. Christmas Carol is by far the shortest. Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations are both around 250 pages each in this collection. Great Expectations is also a fair bit bigger than I thought. In fact, Great Expectations, I think, is the biggest one of them all. It's over 300 pages, because this is almost a 900-page book. So yeah, that aside, a really nice piece. Now, what I was saying in my previous video is about how I have criticisms of the Western canon. And whilst I feel that these books show off classic literature really well, and I'm very positive about these, one of the things that I like about this collection is that you can get books like this, which is a collection of books by Jules Verne. Now, this is not necessarily the only one I go for. There is another collection by Jules Verne. This one's the one that I own because it's a Canterbury Classic and it matches the set. So I bought them all together, and this is the one I ended up with. However, this contains 5 Weeks in a Balloon, A Journey to the Centre of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and Around the World in 80 Days. So I'd argue his three most famous stories, and 5 Weeks in a Balloon, which is not what I would call one of his best known. There is, however, another book which I'm going to put a picture of here, and this is a different Leatherbound Classics version of Jules Verne's work, which contains 7, including From the Earth to the Moon, which I think is a very important one of Jules Verne's works. So you may want to consider that book instead, but as I don't own it, I can't speak to its quality. It does, however, appear to be quite good, and from what I've looked up, it looks to be a decent quality book. This, however, is a lovely high quality book. I love this as an example of Jules Verne's work. It has 3 out of the 4 most important of Jules Verne's works, I feel, and it has a really nice introduction to Jules Verne, which is again very in depth. It's a good let's see. 14 pages worth of background and history as to who Jules Verne was and what they achieved. And I think that's a really nice way of putting these collections in place, because it means that you can have not just a book about the author and about their key works, but also something that introduces who they were, what their legacy was, and how they've influenced the culture that we're all in. Now, this is where I have a criticism of the Western canon. Most examples of the Western canon that academia will put out would not include Jules Verne. Jules Verne is, alongside a few others that I have here, one of the most influential and important writers of the emergence of science fiction. What Jules Verne has written is fantastic to read today. It is not just a great example of science fiction, but because of the era it was written in, it now takes on a whole new feel. If you go back and read those stories now, they don't feel like science fiction anymore. They feel like steampunk. It's bizarre to imagine it, but what it actually feels like is some kind of alternative fantasy fiction. Because we're going back over 100 years and then jumping forwards to a time where technology has advanced, but not in the way that it did for us, which is fascinating to read. It's some alternative historical fantasy fiction. And that's a wonderful way to go back and read these things, experience them as an alternative world. They are the sci-fi of their day, and they still have the scientific principles built in, which means that when you read them as historical fantasy, they read like they've had one of the hardest and most grounded fantasy systems put in place. You won't find random magic in these stories. You'll find instead technology that behaves in ways we know it won't, but is consistent to the principles they think works in that world. And that is amazing. Like the way that the way that Jules Verne describes a submarine in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is nothing like what a submarine actually ended up being. But it's incredible to read what he envisioned being the scientific advancements we would make into undersea exploration. It is really, really intriguing. It's the reason why From the Earth to the Moon being missing from this book is such a shame, because Jules Verne's description of a spaceship, of a rocket, is really, really well put together. Like, it is surprisingly close to a description of the space shuttle. So yeah, I highly recommend giving someone like Jules Verne a close examination. It's not just Jules Verne. I have a few more on this shelf, which I'm not going to go over in depth here, and that would include H.G. Wells and H.P. Lovecraft, both of which are incredibly influential when it comes to science fiction and horror. And I feel that neither of them are given really any focus. The only example I can think of a fantasy author that has the same level of influence would be J.R.R. Tolkien. And at the very least, you'll find that literary groups and people who push the Western canon will at least acknowledge Lord of the Rings as being massively influential. But the works of Lovecraft and the works of H.G. Wells are not considered to be important enough that they get added to the list. They'll add loads of literary fiction people who wrote a random drama that no one really remembers and no one really cares about, but they deem that it was of literary merit and literary value. And honestly, I feel that there is a sense of elitism and gatekeeping in the literary world when it comes to what they label genre fiction. Genre fiction is a derogatory term for any fiction that isn't literary, which just means any fiction we deemed to be below our quality standards, because literary fiction just means fiction of a high quality. That's all it means. So if someone describes something as genre fiction, what they're calling it is shit fiction. That's genre fiction. What they're saying is, oh, you're reading shitty fiction. Oh, right, okay. Hey, you enjoy your shitty fiction. I'm going to read the good fiction. That's what they mean. Don't claim that it's anything else. It's fucking not. Right? Genre fiction and literary fiction means shitty fiction and good fiction. And I'm sorry, but you're wrong. You're just wrong. Literary fiction isn't good fiction. It's shite. Literary fiction, as a concept, is a load of bullshit. If you think that you can speak to the human condition, which as a phrase, by the way, if you see that as a dog whistle to literary academic types of pseudo-intellectuals, the kind that follow philosophy and believe that it makes them a better person, those idiots. If they ever describe something as speaking into the human condition, that's a dog whistle to mean I think this makes me better than you. And honestly, books can speak to the human condition regardless. It doesn't need to be a piece of literary fiction, as they describe it. Loads of books talk about important and deep parts of the human condition. A great example would be Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings, which is a book that I don't particularly rate highly. I think it's very flawed. And yet, it is very, very deeply rooted in discussions of mental health, depression, suicide, things like Alzheimer's and other forms of delusion or problems with the retardation of the mind because of age. Those kinds of things are harrowing to imagine. Like, I can only imagine what it would feel like to lose your memories and realise that your perceptions can't be trusted. And that's covered heavily in The Way of Kings. I can only imagine what it's like to go through extreme torture and torment, and how those things would affect your mind. and I don't need to imagine and have experienced what it's like to be in a deep fit of depression and to feel suicidal. And it is portrayed with dignity and care. And yet it's also a book with giant soul-cutting swords, magic power armour, and giant crab monsters. Because why not? Why can't a book be an introspective discussion about loss and grief and have a dragon in it? This is the problem I have with so-called literary fiction, and it's the biggest issue I have with the Western canon. You see, for all I said in my previous video about how much I like and respect the Western canon and want to promote it, I want to promote a Western canon that isn't arrogant, dismissive, and up itself. That acknowledges science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Because honestly, I don't think that they're lesser genres. I don't think that a genre is, by definition, lesser, as if literary fiction isn't just the drama genre, which is what it is. It's contemporary drama. That's the genre. So you're also genre fiction dickheads. I don't think that this stuff is inferior. In fact, I think that science fiction, fantasy, and horror really started in the mid-1800s. That's when it really started to find its footing. And whilst it doesn't have the history of contemporary writings and drama and romance, which makes up what most people think of as the Western canon, I think in the last 150 to 170 years or so, what we've seen is the rise of genres: fantasy, sci-fi, horror, and then they split off into various different areas. So we end up with things like space operas, psychological horror, cosmic horror. We end up with different takes on sci-fi. We end up with sci-fi focused on time travel or on alternate realities, technological-based sci-fi. These don't really have names as subgenres. Sci-fi still hasn't progressed to that point yet. We have sci-fi, which kind of a catch-all term. We have cyberpunk and dystopia, which take elements of sci-fi, but honestly are more political dramas. And incidentally, because of that reason, dystopians are accepted into literary canon. It's why George Orwell's 1984 is gladly accepted alongside things like Brave New World and Fahrenheit 451 as examples of literary fiction. They're dystopians. They belong to a genre. They're fucking genre fiction. You don't get to fucking pick the genre you like and add it to your shelf. Fuck you, you arrogant pricks. As you can guess, I have no love lost for the academic types in this area. They are arrogant and condescending, and I don't like them. I never studied literature at university. I've never studied the arts in any professional manner, and I consider those who did study the arts to be largely arrogant and pretentious. I have yet to find someone who actually studied literature who was considerate of anything outside of the literary fiction bubble, and wasn't up themselves. That didn't have a superiority complex. So yeah, I feel that sci-fi has still yet to grow. Cyberpunk has taken on a life of its own, and is interesting in that the cyberpunk genre took off, and now technology has met up with it very quickly, so much so that a lot of the tropes and trends in a cyberpunk world are now becoming more and more contemporary, to the point where we're having the opposite effect of what happened with Jules Verne's work, where what started out as sci-fi is now becoming contemporary work, because the predictions they made, whilst a lot of them were fanciful and often portrayed as extremes, like it was purposely portrayed as being an extremist ideal of the future. Corporations taking almost complete control, social divisions becoming extremely heightened, body modification becoming the norm, and fascist overreaching governments. Does that not sound like today? Like, we may not be at the point where we are full-blown cyberpunk, but does that not feel like we have moved in that direction from, say, the 1970s and 1980s? Like, in the last 40 to 50 years, all of those things have become more true today than we ever thought they would have been. So cyberpunk is a fascinating subgenre. Sci-fi, as a broad genre, has many different aspects to it, but space opera is probably the only real breakout subgenre where you can say this actually is a breakout genre. Where this is something that we can identify and we can talk about. And space opera has incorporated many of the elements of fantasy, to the point where we even have now fantasy space operas where there's almost no sci-fi. To the point where there are space operas. Where space opera's now kind of merged, like there's sci-fi and there's fantasy, and then there's space opera here, where you have sci-fi space opera like The Expanse, where they explain the science and they justify at least the majority of the things they do as being moderately science-based, whilst telling a human personal story. And then you have fantasy, where you have things like Star Wars, where you legitimately have space wizards with magic swords and lightning powers fighting in a giant doom fortress in space. You couldn't get more fantasy if you tried. Like, the amount of fantasy tropes in that are palpable, really. So space opera has taken on a life of its own, and is probably one of the most influential genres in fiction now. Horror has expanded to include cosmic horror, body horror, psychological thrillers. There are so many different aspects to horror as well that are so often overlooked. And horror also merges with fantasy. Like, Stephen King is thought of as a horror author, but almost all of his horror novels contain a supernatural element, like a ghost or a vampire or a giant evil demon clown creature. How is that not a fantasy novel as well? It's on that line. It has influence from fantasy. Urban fantasy is the exact point in the middle between horror and fantasy, where you have things like vampires and sorcerers and things like that in the real world. And often they mix and merge parts of the horror genre in with fantasy. I find that fascinating again. Fantasy is probably the one genre that has exploded, by far the most popular genre of the three. There are so many different kinds of fantasy now. There's the Arthurian legend, there's the traditional swords and sorcery, there's epic political fantasy, there is portal fantasy, urban fantasy we've already mentioned. There's now new trends such as the flintlock fantasy trend, and steampunk, which take on elements of sci-fi or historical fiction and blend them into fantasy in a way that creates whole new concepts. Then there's things like grimdark, which takes the tone of a thriller or a horror and inserts it into a fantasy world to create a new tonal shift in high fantasy, epic fantasy, portal fantasy. It's still the same genre, but with a new tone. The fact that you can go so far with all of these different things in literature is what I want to see expressed in the Western canon now. I love the Western canon because I think that it is an important foundation for our society and a representation of my culture, as I said in the last video. But I want to see the Western canon acknowledge the new genres, the new geek culture genres that represent the current zeitgeist of modern Western culture. Because modern Western popular culture is geek culture. Comic books, video games, sci-fi and fantasy. These are the things that are the top of the cultural hierarchy at the moment. The MCU is the biggest franchise to have ever existed. Video games are now a bigger entertainment medium than Hollywood. Geeks are no longer the counterculture movement. They are the cultural revolution. So yeah, I feel that we should acknowledge these things. We should also acknowledge things like comic books and their influence, though that's for another time, I think. There is a lot of stuff within our cultural traditions that we should acknowledge, that we should respect, and we should enjoy for its own value. I have here a book of Mark Twain novels, and it is one of the few pieces of Western canon that is very, very pointedly American. And Mark Twain's novels are regularly treated like shit because of the racial aspects of the novels. But that's the point of the novels. You need to know from the perspective of the writer and the time that it was written. You need to know that those racial ideas were present, and what you're reading isn't a racist text. It is a text that is describing the morality of the time and actually very progressive in its views. Mark Twain was a visionary. And yes, he uses the word nigger multiple times throughout his books because the word nigger is just a word. And at the time it was perfectly normal. And no, I won't say N-word, I will say nigger, get the fuck over it. The fact is, what he's doing is isolating an issue that is one of the most important issues in American politics and American society. American literature is about race, sadly. British literature is very much not. I don't really enjoy American literature for that reason. I find that it is way too focused on race relations. You are, as a country, obsessed with the colour of your skin, and it's sad. But at the same point, some of the literature that came out of that is very important because it shows the direction that culture was going in at the time. It shows the direction that society moved in, and I think that Mark Twain managed to capture that very well and made a lasting impression with the books he wrote. So I'm going to read them and I'm going to keep them, and I don't give a shit if it contains a word that people find offensive. A little addition there. So let's hope that we can move forwards and we can rebuild the Western canon into something that's a little more representative of our culture. Not representative of different skin colours, not representative of different countries. No, we don't need to add in more black literature. No, we don't need to add in more Asian literature. This is the Western canon. It is Western culture it's representing. What we do need to add in, though, is more diversity of thought, more diversity of genres, and some more of the influential authors of the 1800s that really shaped sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. Maybe even make a little room for those of the 1900s, such as Isaac Asimov, for example. There's a lot that we could add to this list that is overlooked, and I have my own list. I think that I have a list of what I would call my top 50 books that represent the modern Western canon as I see it. And I will announce that list at a later time and maybe make that into something of a feature for this channel. Because there are many books on that list that I've read, and a few on that list that I haven't, that I know are important from reputation and discussion alone, that I need to read, that I want to read to get more of a perspective. So perhaps we can go over our list, and if you will indulge me, maybe you'll find some value in the top 50 list I put together, and maybe you'll agree in the end that what I see as the foundations of our culture truly are worth preserving, worth promoting, and worth teaching to future generations. And that is the review of the Canterbury Leatherbound Classics and a critique of the Western canon. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye.